Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The sky above Kentonville often wore a color that couldn't be named, something between faded ash and reluctant blue, especially in the early hours, when the breeze still tasted like last night's dreams. Irene had always loved those quiet mornings when the world hadn't quite woken up, when the chirping of birds felt like a lullaby to everything broken. She lived her life like that, softly, kindly, like someone tiptoeing through a glass corridor, afraid of making noise. People said she was too calm for her own good, the kind of woman who'd serve you food even if you just broke her heart. But Irene never saw it as weakness. To her, love was a language written in silence, in gestures, in being present when the applause was gone. And when she met Olamide, she thought she'd found someone who understood that language too. He was quiet in a way that made you curious, like a man hiding his songs behind locked lips. He didn't chase her or charm her with a silver tongue. He simply stayed, like a tree rooted by the riverbank. And to Irene, that felt safer than butterflies. Their courtship was made of shared silence and knowing glances, of fingers brushing over the same Bible page at midweek service, of walking home from the pharmacy in a hush that never felt awkward. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words landed like rain on dry soil, measured, deliberate, purposeful. She believed his silence was a form of thoughtfulness. But sometimes silence can be a mask, a velvet curtain drawn across a room full of shadows. The day they got married, the sun burned through the clouds with the kind of quiet grace Irene had always craved. Nothing loud, no brass bands or dancing masquerades, just the small compound of Mama Timmy's house, a white canopy, a rented speaker, and plates of jollof rice balanced on laps. Olamide had worn a native attire and soft gray with white embroidery, and Irene, in a simple lace gown sewn by her neighbor's cousin, looked like a cloud that had fallen to earth. Mama Timmy wept openly, calling her a jewel in the palm of her hand, and every neighbor who came to eat said Olamide had scored a rare blessing. Irene's parents, though no longer together, sat on opposite ends of the front row, their stiff silence thicker than the heat. But even that couldn't dim her joy. Olamide held her hand with a surprising firmness that day, and for a moment it felt like all the noise outside her life had gone quiet. Their small apartment wasn't much, a two-room flat with peeling green paint and a water tank that groaned like an old man every time it filled. But Irene filled it with the scent of fried plantain, gospel songs humming from her lips, and laughter that bubbled up like a stream, discovering a new path. And though Olamide remained reserved, he didn't raise his voice, didn't raise his hand, didn't disappear into the night. He simply returned each day, kissed their baby on the head, and sat beside her while she talked about nothing and everything. She believed that was enough. But some storms don't come with thunder. Some simply seep in like a leak behind a wall, silent, steady, destructive. It began with whispers about a better life abroad, planted like a seed during one of Olamide's rare conversations at his friend's naming ceremony. A cousin had just relocated to Eastmere, and the stories he told painted the place like a city of golden bricks, steady power, good pay, clean streets, and the chance to breathe without counting coins. Olamide returned home that night with a strange light in his eyes, the kind that flickered more than it shone. Irene watched him talk with sudden energy, pacing the room as he outlined a plan to leave Kentonville behind. They would apply for visas, settle quickly, and give Lana, their sweet, chubby-cheeked daughter, a future where she wouldn't inherit struggle like hand-me-down clothing. Irene hesitated, not because she doubted the dream, but because she knew how deeply rooted they were in borrowed money. Still, she trusted him. She had always trusted him. So when he said the funds needed to move fast, that his account was more stable for international transactions, she borrowed the last chunk they needed from her boss at the pharmacy and transferred it straight to him. She even apologized for the delay. Olamide had kissed her forehead that evening and said, "You're my peace, Irene." And like a lamb led to still waters, she believed him. But peace, she would later learn, is not always the absence of noise. It is also the presence of truth. Time passed as it always does when you're waiting for life to begin. Weeks bled into each other like ink on wet paper, and Irene kept asking gentle questions about the documents, the embassy dates, the contacts Olamide claimed to have. At first, he answered in riddles. They said next week, one document is delaying, the agent is not picking. But soon the riddles stopped coming altogether, and silence became the new answer. Irene noticed how he stared at his phone more, how his eyes twitched when a call came in, how he started pacing at night like a man whose thoughts refused to sleep. She didn't shout. That wasn't her way. Instead, she watched. She watched as the suitcase they'd bought remained unopened in the corner. She watched as the dollar equivalent of the money she sent never reflected in any receipt. And then one night, when Lana had finally fallen asleep after hours of teething cries, she stood at the kitchen sink with suds clinging to her wrists and asked him, "Olamide, where is the money?" He didn't answer. Not immediately. Not with words. He just sat down slowly at the dining chair, rubbed his palms together like he was trying to scrub off guilt, and finally looked up at her with a gaze that had the weight of a falling roof. "I thought I could double it for us," he said. "I played a game online. I lost it all." And just like that, her world shattered, not with a crash, but with a whisper. The silence that followed Olamide's confession was unlike any Irene had ever known. It didn't howl or whimper. It simply hung in the room like thick humidity, unmoving, uncomfortable, and impossible to ignore. Her hands, still wet with dishwater, trembled slightly as she reached for the nearby towel, but missed it completely. The kitchen light flickered above her like an unsure heartbeat, throwing soft shadows on the wall, as if the house itself recoiled at his words. She didn't scream, didn't raise her voice, didn't even ask how much he had lost. All her questions dissolved into a single question mark that curled into her throat and refused to come out. She turned her face away from him, not in anger, but in disbelief, as if avoiding his eyes would shield her from the splinters of betrayal flying around like invisible daggers. And then, as softly as the dawn breaks the grip of night, the tears came. They came like a quiet flood, not wild or wailing, but steady, each drop carving its own path down her cheek, collecting at the corner of her mouth, like the bitter taste of dreams deferred. Lana stirred in her crib nearby, her tiny hands clenching and unclenching, as if she too sensed that something sacred had cracked inside the walls of their home. Olamide sat like a statue, unable to offer words or comfort, knowing that even 1,000 apologies would not serve as scaffolding for what he had broken. That night, the walls of their house didn't echo with voices. They echoed with absence of trust, of peace, of the future they had painted in bright strokes that now ran and smudged like wet paint left in a storm. By morning, Irene hadn't slept. She had sat on the edge of the bed for hours, her hands wrapped around her knees, eyes unfocused, as if waiting for her thoughts to catch up with her emotions. Olamide had moved to the sofa sometime in the night, unable to face the sobering weight of what his choices had done. The baby, blissfully unaware, woke with a cry just as the first light tracked through the curtain. Irene rose without speaking and went about her morning routine like an automaton, bathing Lana, feeding her, changing the sheets, only this time her movements were mechanical, drained of the joy that used to live in her fingertips. It wasn't until mid-morning that she reached for her phone and, with hands still unsteady, dialed Mama Timmy's number. Her voice shook when she spoke, but she didn't have to explain much. Mama Timmy had always been the kind of woman who could read between silences. By afternoon, she arrived in a faded wrapper and blouse, her sandals slapping against the compound floor like a warning bell. The moment she stepped in, she didn't greet Olamide. She walked straight to Irene and took her hand. And when Irene broke into fresh tears, it was Mama Timmy who crumbled first, falling to her knees with the kind of anguish only a mother can carry. "Forgive my son," she whispered, holding Irene's hands against her chest. "Don't leave us like this." And it was us, not him, because in that moment she wasn't defending her child. She was begging on behalf of a household that might not survive another wound. They sat in the living room as evening crept over Kentonville like a quiet thief. The streets outside were busy with children returning from errands, neighbors calling out greetings, and the sizzle of frying peppers drifting from nearby windows. But inside the house, it was as if time had folded in on itself. Olamide finally spoke, his voice hoarse like a broom dragged across cement. He confessed everything, how the urge to gamble had started long before marriage, how he'd won big once during university days and spent years chasing that high again, like a man trying to kiss a ghost. He swore he hadn't planned to hurt her, that he truly believed he'd double the money and surprise her. But all Irene could think about was how trust, once cracked, never breaks clean. It shatters into splinters that cut even in silence. Mama Timmy spoke in turns, sometimes scolding her son with words sharp as pepper, other times cradling Irene, like a daughter born from her own body. Irene didn't interrupt. She just stared at her baby, now asleep in her cot, and wondered how to shield her from a world that felt too unsteady to promise anything. She didn't know if she wanted to stay, but she knew she wasn't ready to leave either. Not because of weakness, but because love, when genuine, doesn't run at the first thunderclap. It stays long enough to see if the clouds will clear. That night, Mama Timmy stayed over, and as they all lay in different corners of the house, the silence returned, not heavy this time, but waiting, like a breath held between two decisions. The following days were unlike anything Irene had known before. She moved through her hours like someone rebuilding from ash, collecting her dignity in quiet handfuls while trying not to trip over the debris of misplaced trust. At the pharmacy, she wore a brave smile, though her eyes betrayed the sorrow stitched beneath. At home, she spoke only when necessary, her voice clipped but not cruel. Olamide kept his distance, cooking meals he didn't eat, cleaning corners she hadn't touched, as if hoping that scrubbing grout could wash away guilt. Mama Timmy stayed for several more nights, a calming presence, often taking Lana outside in the afternoons, so Irene could nap, or think, or simply breathe. Then, one morning, after a long pause between them over breakfast, Olamide said he needed help. Not help to be forgiven, but help to change. The gambling, he confessed, wasn't a mistake, it was a disease. It had its claws in him for years, dressed in secrecy, fed by denial. Irene looked at him across the table, the lines under her eyes deeper than they had been a month ago, and for the first time, she didn't see her husband. She saw a man who was drowning quietly, asking not to be abandoned at sea. She didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded once and stood up to tend to Lana, but the gesture itself was enough to plant a seed. That evening, after Lana had been rocked to sleep, Irene lay beside her daughter and whispered a prayer that wasn't for escape or revenge, but for wisdom, because forgiveness, when stretched too thin, loses its shape. And she needed to know whether the fabric of their love was still strong enough to hold both sorrow and healing in the same seam. The next few weeks moved like someone limping through a fog, slow, hesitant, uncertain. Irene found herself living in a house that now felt like an echo of what it used to be. Even the walls, once vibrant with soft laughter and the aroma of her cooking, had grown colder, as if they too recoiled from the weight of broken trust. She kept to herself mostly, saying little, doing much. Her hands stayed busy, scrubbing, folding, packing Lana's little bag for creche, because idle hands had a way of stirring thoughts she didn't want to entertain. She'd return from work each evening with her brows furrowed, like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Olamide, on his part, walked on eggshells, his movements tentative, his voice barely louder than the ceiling fan hum. It was as if there were two people trapped in the same house, wearing invisible armor, speaking through the bars of wounds they had not yet named. She'd watch him from the corner of her eye sometimes, how he'd take long pauses before answering a simple question, how he avoided her gaze like a thief dodging light. He had begun attending weekly sessions at a local counseling center, and while Irene wasn't sure what exactly he was learning, she noticed the subtle shifts, the way he tried to be more present with Lana, how he left his phone face up now instead of screen down like before. But even then, her heart stayed cautious, like a door bolted from inside, cracked open just enough to let air in, not trust. One Saturday morning, the air was unusually cool, as if the sky had pressed a damp cloth against the face of the town. Irene stood outside with a laundry basket, pinning wet clothes onto the line when Mama Timmy arrived unannounced. Her slippers tapped against the compound floor, with the rhythm of someone carrying purpose. She looked older than she had weeks ago, like a flower losing color in slow motion. "You haven't called me in days," she said, leaning against the wall, her voice low but thick with concern. Irene didn't answer immediately. She focused on clipping a baby onesie to the rope before replying, "I don't know what to say yet." Mama Timmy sighed, pulling her scarf tighter around her head like someone bracing for wind. She spoke of forgiveness, not as something done once, but as a decision made daily, like brushing your teeth or tying a wrapper. "Forgiveness is not forgetting," she said. "It's choosing not to throw the stone every time you feel the weight in your hand." Irene didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't nod. She just kept pinning clothes, her fingers steady but her heart in turmoil. She wanted to believe healing was possible, but trust once fractured had a way of creaking even after it was mended. That afternoon, while Mama Timmy fed Lana mashed yams, Olamide came home from counseling with a worn-out expression and eyes that carried the dust of difficult confessions. He didn't speak much, only said he joined a support group. And when Irene asked why now, after everything, he simply said, "Because I'm tired of lying to my own reflection." That night, Irene lay awake, her body beside Lana's, but her mind far from rest, wondering whether love meant staying through the fire, or knowing when to step away before you turn to ash. As days bled into one another, their routines grew rhythm without melody. Morning greetings were exchanged like handshakes at a funeral, polite, brief, without warmth. Irene would wake first, tend to Lana, prepare breakfast, and leave for work. Olamide, now jobless and focused on recovery, took on most of the domestic duties, almost as if trying to earn his presence back in their lives. He washed, cleaned, bathed their child, and cooked meals that often went untouched. Sometimes Irene would walk into the house and smell a goosey soup or jollof rice, dishes he used to avoid cooking, and feel an odd ache in her chest, unsure if it was pity, gratitude, or the ghost of affection. She began to notice how he spoke to Lana now, how he'd squat to her level and mimic her gibberish, how he'd carry her on his shoulder and hum lullabies off-key. It was as if fatherhood had finally anchored him to something solid. But even with these changes, Irene remained guarded. Every kind word felt like walking barefoot across gravel. You wanted to believe the path was safe, but every step reminded you of old bruises. At church, she still prayed, quietly, inwardly, without grand declarations. Her prayers weren't for miracles anymore. They were for clarity, for a sign, for strength to choose right, even if it hurt. One evening, as she folded clean sheets, she found the travel documents she'd once prepared tucked beneath her Bible. She stared at them, her eyes tracing their worn edges, and realized something painful. Even if forgiveness came, their future would never look the same again. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Olamide broke the silence with a question that pulled the rug from beneath her composure. "Do you still love me?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Irene froze, her fork mid-air, the taste of white rice and fish sauce turning to sand in her mouth. She looked at him, not with anger, but with the kind of searching eyes that seemed to peel back skin and stare at the soul. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think love shouldn't feel like a chore." Alameda looked down, nodding slowly, as if he'd expected that answer, but still needed to hear it burn. "I just needed to know," he murmured. And with that he stood, walked to the room, and closed the door with a gentleness that felt louder than any slam. Irene sat at the table long after, staring at her half-eaten plate, her mind whirling like a storm cloud trying to choose where to rain. That night she journaled for the first time in weeks. She wrote not to solve anything, but to unload the weight that words often carry when left unspoken. She wrote about Lana's laughter, about the ache in her chest when she looked at old wedding photos, about how healing sometimes feels like tearing off a bandage every single day. And as the night deepened, she closed the journal, kissed Lana's forehead, and whispered the only thing she knew to be true. Tomorrow will come, and I will meet it standing. The next morning arrived with the sound of drizzle tapping gently against the zinc roof like hesitant fingers on a stranger's door. Irene had always loved the rain, how it seemed to wash away the heaviness in the air, but today it only deepened the silence inside her. She sat by the window, a cup of lukewarm tea nestled between her palms, staring out at nothing in particular. Her eyes were open, but her thoughts floated like feathers on a slow wind, scattered, weightless, searching for meaning. The tiny creaks of the house and the soft humming of the neighbor's generator filled the gaps that conversation no longer reached. Olamide had taken Lana for a short stroll under an umbrella, and their absence gave Irene space to listen to her own heart, which lately spoke in sighs and long pauses. She touched the corner of her mouth, where a smile used to live more often than not, and wondered when joy had become something she rationed like salt in a lean month. The rain continued its steady rhythm, drumming a quiet tune that reminded her of the day she first met Olamide, how he'd looked at her like she was a quiet song he never wanted to skip. But life had since changed the lyrics, twisted the melody, and now she wasn't sure if the tune was still worth dancing to. She got up slowly, walked to the sink, and rinsed her cup like someone trying to rinse their heart clean of residue. But some stains don't lift with water. Some only fade with time and courage. That evening, Irene stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom, her reflection more familiar than it had been in months. She wore a modest navy dress that fit her in a way that said she hadn't completely let herself go. She had been invited to a small women's fellowship by her colleague, and though she had declined twice before, something in her spirit whispered that she needed to go this time. Not for deliverance or declarations, but just to be among voices that weren't wrapped in pain or tiptoeing around regret. When she stepped out of the room, Olamide looked up from where he sat, feeding Lana mashed bananas. His eyes lingered longer than usual, and for a brief second, Irene felt the weight of his gaze like a scarf wrapped around her shoulders, familiar but foreign. "You look nice," he said quietly, but she didn't respond. Not because she was angry, but because she didn't want to unwrap the emotion his voice carried. She left with a gentle nod and closed the door behind her. At the fellowship, she sat in the second row, barely participating but soaking in the calm that filled the space. A woman gave a short talk on carrying invisible burdens, and every word felt like a mirror pressed against Irene's chest. Tears gathered in her eyes, not the kind born from sorrow, but from release. That night, when she returned home, Lana was already asleep, and Olamide was seated at the dining table reading a small pamphlet. He looked up, unsure if he should speak. Irene walked past him and entered the room. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the house was closing in on her. It felt like a door had cracked open somewhere. 2 days later, as the sun returned with a vengeance and sweat clung to skin like second clothing, Irene sat on the veranda while Mama Timmy visited again. They sat side by side on 2 low stools, sipping Zobo from old jam jars and watching Lana toddle clumsily on the cement floor, giggling at her own feet. The air between them was thick but not tense, more like soup left on the fire too long. Mama Timmy reached over and gently placed a hand on Irene's knee, her skin dry but warm. "How's your heart?" she asked, not in the way people ask to fill silence, but in the way a healer checks a wound. Irene took her time before answering, her eyes never leaving her daughter. "It's learning to beat differently," she said. Not fast, not slow, just careful. The older woman nodded, then spoke about how marriage wasn't always a soft pillow, that sometimes it was a mat on cold cement. She talked about her own journey, how Olamide's father had once battled depression quietly, and how love didn't fix it, but patience did. Irene listened, not as a daughter-in-law, but as a woman learning from another woman's scars. They sat there for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching Lana chase shadows. And in those moments, Irene didn't feel lost. She didn't feel found either, but she felt seen. Later, as the sun began its slow descent behind the roofs of Kentonville, Irene turned to Mama Timmy and whispered, "I'm not sure I can go back to how things were." And Mama Timmy, without looking away from the horizon, replied, "Then don't. Go forward instead." The following week unfolded with more ease than she expected. Not peace. No, peace was still far away like a dream she hadn't fully remembered. But ease, like the first morning your fever breaks and you can finally sit up without the room spinning. Irene returned to her daily rhythms, not because she was escaping, but because life demanded motion. The bills still came, Lana still needed diapers, and her job at the pharmacy still required her to wear a smile that didn't always match her mood. But she noticed things, small things that made her chest ache in unfamiliar ways. Olamide now wrote in a little black notebook every evening, sometimes pausing to think before scribbling again. He started listening more, even when she wasn't speaking. And one afternoon, when she came home with sore feet, she found the house swept, dinner warm on the stove, and Lana already bathed and asleep. There were no grand speeches, no promises wrapped in ribbons. Just a note on the table that read, "I want to earn tomorrow and not beg yesterday." It wasn't forgiveness he was asking for. It was a chance. That night, they didn't talk much. She lay in bed beside Lana, her hand resting lightly on her daughter's chest, and listened to the sound of her breathing. In that steady rhythm, Irene found a strange kind of hope, not loud or blinding, but the soft kind that seeps in slowly, like light under a closed door. The sun had become a quiet companion in their lives again, not too harsh, not too soft, just enough to dry laundry and warm the back of a chair. Irene sat at the edge of their small veranda, cutting vegetables for dinner, her feet bare and brushing gently against the smooth cement floor. Beside her, Lana sat in a faded red basin filled with warm water, splashing with abandon, her giggles ringing out like bells in a distant cathedral. Olamide knelt nearby, rinsing cloth diapers in a bucket, his sleeves rolled and his brow damp with sweat. It wasn't a scene Irene had ever imagined for their marriage, but something about the ordinariness of it all felt like balm on a wound that had stopped bleeding, but hadn't yet healed. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was balancing her emotions on a tightrope. She observed him with silent curiosity, how he held each cloth like it carried meaning, how he worked without trying to impress. The days of him walking around like a shadow ashamed of its own outline had gradually softened into a steadiness that neither demanded attention nor begged for pity. She still didn't know what their future held, but she began to see their present not as punishment, but as pruning, hard, painful, but necessary. They had started talking again, not about love or betrayal, but about groceries, electricity bills, the price of Pampers, and the taste of the new brand of sardines. It wasn't poetry, but it was something. And in marriages, sometimes the survival isn't in the grand gestures. It's in remembering to ask, "Have you eaten today?" and meaning it. On a quiet Thursday evening, just as dusk began drawing shadows along the walls of Kentonville, Irene found herself alone with her thoughts. Olamide had taken Lana to the nearby kiosk to buy biscuits, and the house, for once, felt less like a wound and more like a bandage slowly finding its place. Irene stood at the window watching the sky bruise into deep orange, the color of promise and uncertainty mixed together. Her eyes settled on their small compound gate, the same one she had hoped to walk through for the last time before boarding a flight to Eastmere, the same one that once represented freedom and now symbolized reality. She sighed, not from exhaustion, but from acceptance. Some dreams, she had come to realize, don't die in dramatic fashion. They simply deflate like a balloon left too long in the sun, quietly, slowly, without protest. When Olamide returned, he found her still at the window. He handed her a small sachet of groundnuts and said, "The woman at the kiosk said you like this brand." She took it without a word, cracked one open, and placed it in her mouth. The taste was familiar. Her father used to buy the same type when he still lived at home. It reminded her of a time when life felt simpler, when the only betrayal she knew was when someone drank her malt in the fridge. They sat down afterward, and she asked him, "Do you ever think we'll leave here?" He didn't rush to answer. He looked at her, eyes steady, and said, "Maybe not how we imagined. But I want to leave brokenness behind, even if my feet stay planted here." And for the first time, she smiled, not a full one, but the kind that hinted something within was still capable of warmth. The following weekend, the power supply had taken its usual holiday, and the rechargeable fan in the room had long given up. Irene sat with Lana pressed to her chest, using a folded book to fan the baby while humming under her breath. Olamide stood shirtless in the doorway, a flashlight balanced between his shoulder and cheek as he checked for a fuse replacement in the ancient switch box. In the dim light, Irene studied his profile, the familiar lines of his jaw, the once proud shoulders that now sloped from guilt, the eyes that had once danced with wild ideas and now blinked slowly like someone still adjusting to daylight. He replaced the fuse and flipped the switch. Nothing happened. He sighed. "I'll try again tomorrow," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She didn't offer encouragement. She simply shifted on the bed to make space for him. When he lay beside her, their bodies did not touch, but the silence between them no longer crackled with discomfort. Instead, it hummed like two rivers running beside each other, separate but close. Irene turned to him in the dark and asked, "Did you always think you could stop gambling without help?" He turned to face the ceiling and whispered, "I thought it was just a bad habit, until I realized it was a chain." She nodded slowly and said, "You wore it like a necklace." They didn't say anything after that. Lana had fallen asleep, her little hand still clutched around a piece of Irene's wrapper. The night outside was still, the kind of stillness that listens. And in that sacred pause, they rested, not as lovers or enemies, but as two people trying to find a way back to themselves. That Monday, Irene returned home from work earlier than usual to find Olamide sweeping the backyard, a radio playing softly from the windowsill. The song was an old one, something her mother used to hum when life felt too heavy. She watched him from the doorway for a moment before stepping forward. "I saw a part-time cleaning job opening at the clinic," she said. "It's not much, but it pays weekly." He looked up, surprised by the softness in her tone. "Do you think I should apply?" She shrugged. "I think you should try." He nodded, wiping his forehead with the edge of his t-shirt. The moment passed without fanfare, but something shifted in the air. Later that evening, as they ate quietly, Irene told him she'd begun putting aside a little from her salary. Nothing big, just a start. "For Lana's schooling," she said. "Not abroad. Just something solid." Olamide didn't argue. He simply reached for his notebook, wrote something down, and left it open. Irene glanced at the page when he went to rinse his plate. It read, "Today she included me in a plan again. I will not waste it." She didn't say anything, but she folded that sentence into her chest like a new currency, one not made of promises, but of effort. That night she didn't sleep easily, but she did sleep beside him, not in complete trust, but in the fragile peace of a woman who had seen a seed break ground, and for now, that was enough. The morning Lana turned 1, the sky wore the soft gray of humility, as if even heaven understood that not every milestone needed trumpets. Irene woke early, not out of excitement, but out of habit, the kind mothers develop when love becomes a responsibility stitched into their bones. She moved quietly, her feet bare on the cool tiles, gathering flour and eggs for the small cake she planned to bake. They couldn't afford a big celebration, and there would be no crowd, no music blaring from rented speakers. Just the three of them, a small balloon taped to the cracked wall, and a candle shaped like the number 1. As the batter rose in the oven, Irene leaned against the sink and watched the tiny flame of the stove flicker. It reminded her of herself, tired but still burning. Olamide came out of the room, wearing a faded white t-shirt and joggers, the kind she used to iron for him when their dreams still lived in suitcases. He looked at her, then at the cake pan, and smiled the kind of smile that didn't need words. He took Lana from her back, kissed the child's cheek, and said, "She looks like you when she sleeps, with her mouth slightly open like she's dreaming of pepper soup." They chuckled, and the sound floated through the house like a bird that had finally found an open window. The cake came out slightly cracked in the middle, but it smelled of vanilla and second chances. They ate it together, no forks, just fingers, laughter, and frosting on Lana's nose. It was the most honest celebration Irene had ever known. Not perfect, but deeply human. In the weeks that followed, life didn't suddenly bloom into magic. Bills still knocked like stubborn creditors, and there were nights the only thing between them and hunger was leftover pap and determination. But there was a steadiness now, a rhythm that didn't promise luxury, but offered stability. Olamide got the cleaning job at the clinic and wore his new uniform like a badge of redemption. Each morning he left the house with a lunch bag Irene packed, returning in the evenings with stories about the patients he helped and the jokes the nurses told. His steps grew lighter with each passing day, and though guilt still clung to him like a shadow at sunset, he no longer let it lead. Irene began taking on extra shifts at the pharmacy, not to run from home, but to build something with her own hands, something that didn't depend on chance or borrowed money. Their conversations returned in fragments, some about groceries, others about how Lana now babbled data and clapped whenever the radio played. One evening, while folding clothes together, Irene asked, "Do you still crave it?" Olamide paused, his hands lingering on a baby bib. "Sometimes," he said, "but I crave our peace more." And that was enough for her. Not because it erased the past, but because it proved he was finally wrestling with the right things. She no longer looked at him through the lens of what he broke, but through the quiet conviction of someone who knew that healing wasn't a destination, it was a decision made daily in the dark. Their home transformed, not with money, but with intention. Irene began hanging small motivational notes on the walls, handwritten phrases like "brick by brick" and "keep choosing each other." She bought a potted plant with her first bonus, a modest fern they named Hope, and placed it beside the Bible on their center table. Mama Timmy continued to visit, bringing warm akara in paper wraps and watching Lana with the wide-eyed wonder of a grandmother trying to memorize time. One Saturday, as they sat under the mango tree in the compound, Olamide stood up, cleared his throat, and knelt before Irene, not with a ring or flowers, but with a folded letter. "I wrote this during one of my darkest days," he said, placing it in her lap. "But I'm giving it to you now that light is slowly returning." She opened it and read his words, handwritten with trembling ink, "To the woman who loaned me not just money, but grace, I failed you. But I want to spend my life paying back not the debt of Naira, but the debt of your mercy. If you choose to walk with me again, I'll carry every bag of your burden and never drop it this time." Irene blinked, her eyes moist with something too sacred to name. She didn't speak immediately. She reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his, and whispered, "Let's walk." No ceremony, no fireworks. Just two tired souls, choosing again. By the time the year rounded out, their lives had not blossomed into perfection, but they had begun to taste the fruit of endurance. Lana started attending a small daycare center, where she quickly became known for her loud laugh and insatiable curiosity. Irene had begun mentoring a few younger women at church, not from a pedestal of wisdom, but from the raw ground of experience. She shared what she could about betrayal, about holding on, about letting go of expectations that break the back of joy. Olamide, now cleaner-in-chief at the clinic, had saved enough to buy them a small fan for the room, and surprised Irene with it one evening like it was gold. No more hot nights, he said, grinning. She laughed and replied, except when I'm angry with you. They shared that joke for weeks. And though there were still nights she lay awake, tracing her thoughts like fingers over braille, there were more mornings she woke with gratitude tucked beneath her ribcage. They had been battered, bent, and bruised, but they weren't broken. In the final week of the year, they sat together during the crossover service, their hands clasped, their eyes closed. And when the clock struck midnight and voices around them shouted hallelujah, Irene looked at her husband, not as the man who lost their savings, but as the man who stayed, who fought, who grew. She whispered into his ear, "Thank you for choosing to rebuild with me." And in that moment, the past no longer held them hostage. They were free, not because the road ahead was certain, but because they had learned how to walk it together, one quiet, stubborn step at a time. Sometimes the greatest storms in life don't come with thunder. They come in silence, through betrayal, through broken trust, through the quiet disappointments that steal our peace, piece by piece. Irene's story reminds us that love is not only about the sweet beginnings or the joyful milestones, it is also about choosing, re-choosing, and sometimes rebuilding from scratch. Pain may bend you, but it doesn't have to break you. And while forgiveness is not forgetting, it is freeing yourself from carrying what you did not cause. If you find yourself in a place where your trust has been broken or your dreams have been shaken, pause and ask yourself, is there still life here worth fighting for? Is the person beside you still reaching for change, not just in words, but in actions? If yes, then maybe grace still has room to work. If not, it's okay to choose peace over proof. Never lose yourself while trying to fix someone else. But if the one who wounded you is also the one who is kneeling with you to heal, then maybe, just maybe, the wound can become a testimony, not of perfection, but of perseverance. Remember, healing isn't loud. Sometimes it comes like a whisper, a kind gesture, a shared chore, or a soft moment of laughter after weeks of silence. Be open to it. And above all, don't be ashamed to start again. Even a cracked wall can still shelter love if both hands are willing to patch it. Heavenly Father, we thank you for stories that mirror our pain and remind us of your quiet grace. Thank you for the strength you gave Irene when her heart felt like it was torn at the seams. Thank you for the transformation you began in Olamide, the kind that cannot be faked, but must be born from surrender. Lord, for everyone listening who has been betrayed, forgotten, or disappointed, I ask that you wrap them in peace that doesn't need explanations. Let them know that even when life loses its rhythm, you are still composing something beautiful behind the scenes. For the ones struggling in silence, give them courage to speak. For the ones who have been too hurt to hope again, give them one small reason to believe. For the homes that feel like battlefields, breathe restoration into their walls. And for the hearts that are choosing to stay and fight for healing, grant them patience, wisdom, and renewal. Teach us, Lord, that mercy is not weakness, and that forgiveness is not foolishness when it is paired with discernment. Help us see the difference between someone who wants to change and someone who only fears consequences. May we always be guided by your Spirit and not by fear, bitterness, or public opinion. And Father, for every family listening, no matter how cracked, how tired, how stretched, remind them that with you, nothing is ever truly wasted. Even the shattered pieces can shine again in your hands. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.